Hi, it's Dave. So in this video, I want to share some thoughts on giving strategies and especially kind of focus on what I call a generational giving opportunity. I'm going to put this on my parenting channel for now, just because I want to just be free to ramble and, just make kind of a full kind of case on just giving. And so I think there are various different types of giving. I think first off, there's a traditional giving approach, and that's like you give to an organization. And I think one of the things is with the organization is it comes with a certain level of bureaucracy to that organization. And there are pros and cons to this. For example, one pro is, an organization can handle certain things very well. They can do receipting, they can do newsletters, updates, they have a board of directors, there's accountability, transparency, there are standard accounting measures, they can give, 501c3 tax deductions. Definitely a ton of benefits. However, there are some cons as well. And one of the cons is that as an organization, it takes energy to keep the organization running itself, right? And then that's in addition to the work, right, that they're doing outside of the organization. So there's a certain amount of energy required just to run, right, the bureaucracy or, the people inside the organization. And I think this works well and it works okay, actually, when the problem the organization is working on is kind of steady and it's needing slow progress towards certain long-term goals. So in other words, it's not a fast-moving or fast-changing, right, situation, because a lot of the times these organizations aren't very good at fast-changing situations, right? It's more of a steady type of thing where an organization that has some bureaucracy, like steadiness to it, and there are some inefficiencies, yet just that kind of steady, kind of slow-moving, eating away at the problem is what you want or is what is worth it, right? And so this is kind of the first type of what I call traditional giving. And for this type of giving, I personally have a donor advised fund at Fidelity Charitable. And what that allows me to do is I gift stock shares a few times a year. I've been doing this for probably about 5-6 years or so. And I just give a few times a year, and then the stock gets, you get a tax deductible receipt or deduction off of that. And then it gets pulled into account where you get to decide which charities to give at your pace, right? And you don't have to spend it all at once or all in a certain time period. And then I get to decide which charities to give and what causes. And it's great because, I could it's just set up there, and it's just, money that's ready to give. Also, I set up recurring donations to my favorite charities or causes, and that's great too because it's kind of something you can have in the back of your mind that you're always kind of supporting a certain group. Now, there are, with this type of kind of approach, there's going to be some inefficiencies, right, that you're going to have toward the organization and maintaining that organization. And I think that's part of running a nonprofit because hey, you're working on a longer term problem that addresses certain needs. But besides that, I think there are actually a couple other, and maybe many other, giving approaches. And they're quite fascinating to me. I kind of want to kind of focus on those more. So one of kind of these alternative or different giving approaches is more of the personal giving opportunity. So this isn't through an organization, but it's rather directly to the needs of people, like directly in relationships. So it could be close people around you. It could be the homeless person you meet down the street. It could be, a person, in your own locality or city that's, in need. And rather than relying on an organization, you actually take it upon yourself to actually reach out personally, like in a relationship, and actually give in that context. And I think it's great because I think sometimes or some people at least, including myself, we tend to rely on organizations too much to do certain things for us. I think sometimes that can miss the point. Part of giving, in my opinion, is that it is for ourselves too, right? And part of the context and the nature of giving is that it should be, and it could be personal in a lot of ways too. I think having more of a personal giving approach as part of your giving strategy, I think is fantastic. I think it's a missed point by a lot of people. Now, there's another type of giving opportunity, which is kind of what I call hypercrisis giving. And during hypercrisis giving, I think there can be some type of, interesting, monumental type of impact that can happen during these hypercrises. Not that you can't have monumental impact in other ways, like with other giving approaches. I think you can, but it's a different type of impact in a shorter amount of period, but it requires an immense amount of intensity and problem solving. So I think this hyper crisis giving opportunity or strategy is probably the most complicated, but yet it could be one of the most interesting and rewarding in different ways. You see, there are certain times in history where there are crises, where things change super fast and you have major repercussions, and you have people that are negatively affected, and their future can be altered completely by certain small yet profound decisions. Like, for example, if you had to grow up in Afghanistan under the Taliban for the next 100 years, right? Let's say your kids, their kids' kids, their kids. Let's say 4 generations grows up, you and 4 generations in Afghanistan under Taliban. Now compare that with 4 generations, right, starting from you growing up in a free country. The amount of discrepancy, right, is immense. But what's tricky about it is the discrepancy actually grows the longer, right, time goes on. For example, the first year you might think that you're yearning for the comforts of home. Like, oh man, under Taliban would be better than being a stateless refugee somewhere else, right? But after 10 or 20 years, you're going to see probably a wide difference where it's like, oh my gosh, freedom, right? Compared to what's going on, right, in Afghanistan, Taliban. Take North Korea and South Korea, for example. For the first 5 years after, let's say, the Korean War, the living standards were actually comparable. And some people actually thought North Korea had better living standards, actually. But 30 or 40 years later after that, it's a completely different story. You have completely different universes, right? Like, it's completely starkly different. And I think that's interesting. The longer the time, right, goes, the more the differences come out. And I think that's, it sheds light on the importance of certain decisions where, a small decision of whether you decide to stay in North Korea or decide to cross the border alters the impact of many, many generations of people, right, in your family and others. It's quite profound. I think the challenge with these hyper-crisis opportunities are that things are moving so fast. So it's hard to know exactly like how to make a difference or what's going to make a difference. And I think organizations typically aren't the best at doing this unless they're actually super fast moving themselves. And even then, I think they can drag their feet just because they're a large organization. They have to come to consensus usually, right? Have meetings and all sorts of stuff and try to figure out. But they've got offices and, all sorts of things to maintain a bureaucracy. Anyways, we're facing a really crazy hyper crisis right now. And that is basically the falling apart of Afghanistan and, the Taliban taking control. This crazy exit of the US that just seems so abrupt, yet there's so much happening in every single short time period, whether it's 1 day or 1 week. And because of this, every day is different and every week is different. And just the past week, right? I mean, when did the Taliban take over Kabul? It hasn't even been a week, I think. But yeah, it's been crazy. And it might last maybe another week before, the U.S. heads out. Who knows what the exact, time period? It could be a little bit longer. I don't know. But things are changing, right? And what's happening within a period of just a couple of weeks is a massive amount of millions of people's lives are going to be changed for many generations. And the question is, what do you do in that flash of a period, right? In this quick 1 or 2 week period, things are a complete blur. It's like things are moving so fast. Like, where do people get safe passage? Where do you find reliable information? Like, what's going on, right? Who do you trust, right, with all this stuff? And then in a lot of ways to get this information, right, of how to help people or, what to do, you've got to create sometimes, I think, your own avenues of information and relationships because people don't really know what's going on. And I'm constantly, I don't want to say surprised. By now, I've seen this so many times. I was I saw up close the North Korean kind of refugee crisis in the late 90s, heading out there to the North China region, interviewed a lot of these refugees. It just kind of blew my mind, the life they led, but also just it's just, I think when you sit in a room and hear a story of a North Korean refugee, this was in the late 90s, I took some people out there for our first trip, actually. And you sit in a room for 3 hours or so, hearing their life story, and to hear how crazy, like life is completely different alternative universe in North Korea. And in many ways, right? Not just philosophically or educationally wise, but economically, etc. It changes like the game of how you how you view, right, situations in the world. In 2001, I found myself in Kosovo during the Kosovo refugee crisis, and yeah, I shared in my other video. I was in Afghanistan, 2002, Iraq, 2003, North Korea, 2004, Iran, seeing just firsthand what's going on. And in different type of hypercrisis events or places, what's common is that it's such a chaotic scene that organizations don't even know what's going on. It's too fast, and the people who really know what's going on are really the people like on the ground, like the connectors, the people who like are, for example, on the border, or who are like doing something crazy that it's just like they might be a normal citizen, right? Decided to take 20 people under their wings and head out somewhere to the border, etc. And a lot of times these be the people that have the most information. They're not your typical type of kind of person in your suit, some chief of staff at some organization. A lot of times their information is late in hyper-crisis moments. And I think that kind of exemplifies what's going on here, is that in hyper-crisis moments, sometimes being an organization is not helpful because you've got this maintenance, this bureaucracy, consensus forming, right? It takes longer to get information and to decide on information. Also, in hyper-crisis moments, it's complicated because trust is involved, meaning because there are like security and safety issues going on, because things are changing so rapidly, and people understand there's big stuff at stake, right? The information that you get actually is usually shared via trust. It's like, it's not really like posted anywhere or usually out there. And oftentimes it takes time to build those relationships of trust to access and actually to gather the right information and the real-time information. And then there's this issue of having out-of-the-box thinking, because the situation is changing so fast. It's like hard to find the right solutions, because it's like you have to understand a fast-changing situation. Think about COVID. About a year and a half ago, it was the first few weeks that it just kind of hit everyone. It's like so crazy, like people just didn't know how to process it, right? It took organizations and people, months to really try to come up with an understanding. And in similar ways, in a hyper-crisis moment, if there's a hyper-crisis that only lasts a couple of weeks or something, or there's a major shift, let's say government or geography change or something, most organizations are not going to be able to adapt. They take weeks or months to respond. And even when they respond, they're going to respond too late. And so that's when I think there's sometimes a grassroots effort that can be effective in certain hyper-crisis moments. And it's because of the nature of the situation, right? It's not favorable to larger, more bureaucratic organizations who actually have the most resources, but they can't deploy it in the right way because they're not equipped to do that. Therefore comes along a grassroots movement, which meaning if you can have somebody who actually is on the ground, or is coordinating information, who actually is able to see where things can be, invested in, and where we can get the most outsized impact, then a grassroots kind of effort in certain hyper-crisis, fast-changing actually kind of makes a lot of sense, and it can have huge, I think, outsized impact in a lot of ways. Anyways, it's like Saturday night right now, August 21st here, and we are in the middle of a hyper-crisis moment, Afghanistan. And, it's been a busy week for me. I mean, yeah, it's kind of crazy. Just sleeping really late last night, almost midnight tonight. I don't know when I'm going to sleep here. But the challenge actually is strange in different ways. The challenge really isn't, in this case for me personally, isn't really raising funds, because to be honest, I'm not really interested in raising funds per se. That isn't the goal, right? The problem isn't funds per se. And also I'm, willing to to commit and to spend, a decent amount if it can be super effective in reaching and changing, people's trajectories. But I think the bigger challenge is actually finding the right solution in a hyper-crisis, fast-changing situation. In order to do so, I need to build relationships, and I need to gather information and actually work toward creating, let's say, a safe escape path, right, with a right network of people even on the ground, communicating and coordinating with lots of people, and there's lots of roles involved, and it's really a team effort and a group effort in a lot of ways that's held together by kind of this realization that there are certain moments in history that really make a big difference. And it's glued together by kind of this idea that, hey, certain actions we do right now can actually have a huge outsized impact for many, many generations. And it's glued together through kind of a network of trust and relationships, right? Of people where it's like, as I share on, YouTube and Twitter, I build trust, but I also have this like reciprocal trust to people, in my network, to people watching. And that forms kind of like this really interesting foundation to actually be able to help each other and to work toward interesting things. It's been super fascinating working with people, DMing a ton of people, literally hundreds of people, and many people in my audience and networks, and working toward them and seeing just, people step up. And it's been an awesome privilege to form this type of, relationship. I have no desire to actually, at this moment, to start a nonprofit. I actually ran a nonprofit, back in my 20s. And, I understand the pros and cons, and maybe there might be a time, where I run a nonprofit. I don't know. But at this time, like, I like the kind of the various kind of strategies of giving that I'm doing. I think it's kind of fascinating, like, some of the opportunities that arise. And I think we're in one of these interesting times with hyper-crisis with Afghanistan. I know with Afghanistan, there are different approaches. Like, for example, there's going to be some long-term needs. And I think actually more different organizations might be better suited to certain longer term needs. Actually, they have more resources, more staff, etc. Maybe longer term refugee support services, etc. Right? And so in that sense, I think I'm not so concerned about the mid to long term picture, in the sense where sure, there will be needs, and maybe I will support some groups long term, just as part of my first kind of giving strategy, right? More of these organizations that are working towards more steadily working towards certain goals. But my focus really, just with this whole Afghan kind of refugee escaping thing, crisis, is I just want to see what strategically can be done, in this hyper crisis moment, these few weeks, that could possibly alter, the course of many generations and people in certain families that otherwise wouldn't have happened, right? Without kind of my effort or time, or really catalyzing, right, other people's involvement and stuff. And so anyways, that's kind of the whole approach, is to help people bring together information, help people find escape routes, help with on-the-ground support to get them out. And once they're out, try to help them maybe with 1 to 2 weeks of kind of, lodging and food, and at least steer them in the right direction. And I think, generally speaking, like, that's the main kind of, essence of this, my thinking regarding this hyper crisis. All right. Hope this has been helpful. If you're, I'm on Twitter at HeyDave7. If you want to DM me, you can. But I warn you right now, at this time, it's crazy. Getting a crazy amount of DMs. So it's hard to reply. But, if you have something really specific you want to help out with this, hyper crisis moment, let me know. Otherwise, take care. And it's been great chatting with you guys.